Chapter 30. Newlyweds. Late 1919. Hitched. To be married. The couple was hitched by the justice of the peace. In the fall of 1918 and the winter of 1919, the Spanish flu ravaged many populated places throughout the world. In the single month of October, 195,000 people died. In some cities, the dead couldn't be buried in a timely fashion, as many needed graves. It is estimated that 650,000 perished in America alone, and up to 100 million died worldwide, or roughly 5% of the world's population. It is thought that the flu may have gotten its rapid start at Fort Riley, Kansas. The military spread the virus from camp to camp like a conveyor, and it spread everywhere. It should have been named the Uncle Sam flu. Strong men could die within 12 hours of first symptoms when their lungs filled up with fluid. The avian virus had started from wild birds and may have spread to pigs and then to humans. 1/3 of the world would have the sickness before it faded away in 1920. In Arkansas, 7,000 died statewide, but records were not kept in many rural areas. Therefore, the total number is unknown. The poor suffered the most, as they could not afford bed rest and tried to work too soon. Schools in Arkansas were ordered to close in October of 1918, and gatherings of people were discouraged. Boards and nails were precious and hard to find in rural communities where numbers of the dead needed coffins. Some removed boards and nails from buildings and wagons to use to bury their dead. The backdrop of the world when the newlyweds married in late November of 1918 was rather dismal. Among many other potential problems and hazards, the young Riley Harness family had started in the middle of a pandemic. The house where they were first staying with family on Bear Creek was later called the Lower House, as Riley would have to build the upper house to accommodate additional family members. It was very tight quarters living in the log house, as it was in most cabins throughout the Ozarks. The cramped conditions were breeding ground for the spread of sickness. Perry Harness recalls the first house the newlyweds lived was on the side of the mountain up Lick Hollow. The roof of the house was so bad that they could lay in bed and see stars at night through the gaps in the shingles. Earl Harness said that his parents, Riley and Melinda, moved to live with another couple for a few months on the head of Red River, just south of her parents' Giles and Jody Turney's home. The couple was Robert Russell and Nettie Holstead. Nettie was a cousin on the Wilbank side and also a good friend of Melinda's. Nettie had 2 boys, Cloy and Clyde at the time. Melinda was carrying her first child when they moved into a house nearby on top of the ridge about 2 miles south of Atlas. William Earl Harness was born on October 3, 1919. The house where he was born was called Round Top by the locals. Melinda was 17 years old, Riley was 22, Grandpa Billy was near 61, and Grandma Katie was 55. The Round Top house was a peculiar structure to the area. The early log cabins built in the Ozark Hills were constructed without any iron nails or hinges. A window opening had a wood shutter with wooden hinges and was without glass. The window was basically a small door. The roof normally had a gable construction with a split board roof held into place with poles and heavy rocks. This type of roof construction was made without any nails. However, a round roof would be a real novelty, and I'm unsure how it was constructed. Forged nails made by a blacksmith were very expensive and sized by penny. It is thought that the number of pennies reflected the cost of the nail originally, but cut nails were beginning to come available around the turn of the 20th century reducing their cost. The round roof on an older rural home in 1919 is very intriguing to me. Perhaps it's due to my career as a roofer, but a round-top roof on a house is unique even today. When I lived at Welcome Home, Arkansas in about 1971, we grew some sorghum cane and hauled it to a mill north of Whit Springs, Arkansas, where Ted Horton pressed and cooked off the juice to make us some sorghum molasses. It was near a community called Magic Springs. We drove by an old house that had a round-top roof. My dad said that it was probably like the house where he was born. As I recall, the roof had been covered with tin roofing, but probably had wood originally. It makes me wonder if someone had built some of these round tops in the area. Living at Old Round Top placed little Earl near his Grandpa Giles and Grandma Jody Turney. They could easily visit, and Melinda could be near her mother for help. The story is that Earl had the colic for the first months of his life. Colic is found when a baby cries a lot with intensity and for no apparent reason. The caregiver will usually try to console by any and every means possible. I imagine that young Melinda was thankful for having her mother Jody nearby to help and assure her that Earl was okay. Don't forget that the fear of the pandemic of Spanish flu was full-blown and must have caused a lot of anxiety for everyone with small children especially. One day, Giles passed by the round-top house, and the window was open. Earl was crying, and the new couple was sound asleep. He said he could have reached in through the window and taken Earl, and his parents would have never known he was missing until they became awake. I suppose that's a good reason for Riley living near Giles, as his father-in-law didn't miss much that happened under his watch. With Riley no longer living on Bear Creek and not farming with Billy, I wonder what he was doing to provide for his young family. Perhaps he helped his father-in-law Giles farm and took jobs when he could. Visiting the many homesteads still visible in the Ozark Hills, I've often wondered how they managed to live and provide for their large families. Previously, the demand for white oak had provided many job opportunities, but in 1919, the 18th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution that prohibited the manufacture of alcohol throughout the nation. The oak barrel business was all but shut down. The Missouri and North Arkansas Railroad was having violent strikes by its employees. The strike was long and bitter as men began to sabotage the rails, bridges, and equipment. A man was lynched for possessing explosives in January of 1923. I was told by Dick Bell in the 1980s that he saw the victim hanging from the trestle over Crooked Creek at the edge of Harrison by the light of the moon. He said it was one of the scariest things he ever witnessed. The economic lifeline for many communities was in jeopardy. The downturn and epidemic made it hard to find work or to get a decent price for what you could produce and sell. The Progressive era was coming to a screeching halt. Riley Harness was a man who was steadfast and hard-working. Whatever work he could find to do, he would diligently support his wife and new son. It is notable that when Earl was about 6 months old, that they took him to Leslie to have his picture made. The rather large picture always hung on the wall in the house that I grew up. Earl was a fat baby, and his square jaws were a characteristic that many others in the lineage would share. His daughter Emma has the picture that is now more than 100 years old hanging in her house. Giles had some money, as he was very thrifty, and I'd like to think that he might have paid to have his first grandson's picture made. For a season, Riley and Melinda called the Round Top their home, and on the wall hung the picture of a round-top baby who would bring them a lifetime of joy and pride. The firstborn child helps to set the path that other siblings follow. At the time, Riley reflected on the goodness of God to protect him and his young family from all harms and to provide them shelter and food. Melinda did not acknowledge it yet, but she must have been thankful to have what she could call hers. Furthermore, while Giles had given up a daughter, he then had a son who could help him with the farm. Reflection. The first year of marriage is very important to help set the tone of the future. In the Bible, a man who was newly married did not have to serve militarily, but was to enjoy his wife the first year, Deuteronomy 24:5. As Jenny had to face hardships early in her marriage, so Riley and Melinda saw some very hard days to come. But God sustained them and their family. For whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. Proverbs 8:35. Carnegie couple enjoys gardening. T.L., Uncle Lon, and Aunt Mary Holstead, a Carnegie couple, really enjoy their gardening. This is really newsworthy when you consider Uncle Lon is 97 and Aunt Mary is 89. Mr. Holstead has farmed all his life, beginning back in Arkansas when you worked for 50 cents a day, and that was from sunup to sundown. Of course, back then you raised most of what you ate. Buying flour, coffee, soda, and salt from the grocery store, Lon says he can remember when there just wasn't any money to be had, and he asked his father why. His father told him they had it all baled up like hay on Wall Street and just weren't letting very much out at a time. Holstead must have learned his job well when he was farming, because in a 50-foot square garden, he has rhubarb, watermelons, tomatoes, cabbage, beans, cantaloupe, carrots, black-eyed peas, okra, cucumbers, potatoes, and even garlic. He also has a grapevine on the fence and a peach tree. The peach tree came up voluntarily 3 years ago, and at first he thought he would just cut it down. It was such a pretty tree, he decided to let it grow. Last year, it had a few peaches, and this year it is loaded with fruit, and Mr. Holstead says they are the best peaches he has ever eaten. He has garlic planted around the tree to keep insects away. He says he doesn't know if it works or not, maybe just an old tale, but thought it was worth a try. The garden is perfectly clean, not a weed in sight. In addition to working in the garden, Holstead also mows his own lawn. Mrs. Holstead still does a little housework, too. Uncle Lon says he's getting old enough to know when he's done enough. So he built him a chair, which sits in the shade at the end of the garden. When he gets tired, he just sits down in his chair and looks at the garden until he feels like working some more. He definitely feels that people live longer if they stay active. The couple made their first trip to western Oklahoma in 1906 by train, arriving in Mountain View at 1 a.m. He rented a farm north of Mountain View on the Washita River and lost his crop to the river that year, so they moved back to Arkansas. The family then moved back to Mountain View in 1924 and rented a farm north of Mountain View. This trip was made by covered wagon. En route, they camped out, and in Anadarko, 30 miles from their destination, one mule died. Mr. Holstead then went to town and sent his family on to Mountain View by train. He then had to hire someone to haul the dead mule from the park, which cost him $5. He bought a horse to harness to the wagon with the surviving mule and continued the journey. The trip by wagon from Arkansas took 17 days. Holstead can still remember when fertilizer first was used. As he recalls the story, Lots of farmers refused to use it for fear it would ruin their land. He stated, "I can show you land where fertilizer has been used for 40 years, and the land is better than it was before they started using it." Uncle Lon and Aunt Mary raised 9 children, 7 of whom are still living, and helped their parents celebrate their 75th wedding anniversary. They have lived at their present home here in Carnegie for the past 26 years.